So our next speaker is Mick Smith. Mick is a Queen's National Scholar in the Department of Philosophy and in the Department of Environmental Studies at Queen's University. He's the author of numerous works, including 3 notable books: An Ethics of Place, Radical Ecology, Postmodernity, and Social Theory; The Ethics of Tourism Development from 2003, as well as most recently Against Ecological Sovereignty, Ethics, Biopolitics, and Saving the Natural World from 2011. Mick's also the editor of Emotion, Place, and Culture, a journal, and the co-editor of Emotional Geographies, among numerous articles and book chapters and what have you. Mick's recent work has focused on different understandings of ecological communities, and particularly how these understandings affect our ethical, political, and emotional relations with the more than human world. So understanding community in a multi-species sense. So please join me in welcoming Mick.
What follows is a strand pulled from a vastly more expansive web of material, tugged at and twisted as part of a task of rethinking ecological community, socio-theoretically, evolutionarily, ecologically, ethically, and politically. This thread touches upon and traces loops back and forth between the 19th century natural philosopher Ernst Haeckel and the contemporary political philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy. This reimagined natural history and this rethinking of ecological community are necessary, vital, for every community is, as Benedict Anderson suggests in the context of the nation-state, always also an imagined community. Our understandings of any community's social, evolutionary, ecological, ethical and political effects are inseparable from this imagination. To be sure, our communal imaginations are rarely, if ever, coextensive with the material effects of such communities, but they nonetheless delimit and shape and are shaped by those effects in many ways. If extinction can be envisaged as a loss to ecological community in all of the senses already mentioned, socially, evolutionarily, ecologically, ethically, politically, then the way we imagine communities delimits the way we think extinction can or should touch us, even to the extent that where community is denied, we may not think that such a loss touches us at all. In this way, it also shapes our future relations, including, of course, the responsibilities of the denizens constituting a community, the responsibilities they may have but still may not feel for further extinctions. If the ways we envisage community have no room for other species, as is the case in all dominant political ideologies, or alternatively have no room for ethics or politics, as is sometimes the case in scientific takes on natural or ecological communities, then the event of extinction is only understood. It only resonates within certain limited registers. Today, under the hegemony of neoliberal economics, extinction hardly registers at all. And that is because there is quite literally a world of difference between the economistic imagery of globalization and the materiality of a diminishingly diverse living world, reductively understood as nothing more than a natural resource for that same economic system. We should therefore distinguish, as Nancy suggests, albeit in a predominantly human context, between the creation of the world as an imagined, sensed and lived affirmation of community and economic globalization. The neoliberal world has no place for ecological community. How then to envisage the creation of a world where ecological community still registers? Perhaps, and again in Nancy's terms, we might begin by imagining a community as the tying of a knot that draws things together differently, a placing into relation that presupposes at once proximity and distance, attachment and detachment, intricacy, intrigue, and ambivalence. For Nancy, like Anderson, argues that the community is not a fixed or given totality, and certainly not a matter of isolated individuals being bound together by contracts, but rather a matter of beings placed in contact with, touching each other, of creating the sense of the world together in all of the different registers, the different and diverse senses in which beings experience and are affected by the presence and the absence of others. To put this ecologically, communities are, quite literally, although I think this will inevitably be misunderstood, more or less intimate forms of symbiosis, being placed together in living co-constituting relations, coexistence. Symbiosis is usually, of course, defined in terms of more intensely intimate relations between species, but every ecological community is also, in a broader sense, a living together in place, symbiosis. As an example of a more intimate symbiotic relation, and one which was also intimately close to Haeckel's heart, we could bring to mind the siphonophores, jellyfish-like creatures, the best known of which is the Portuguese man-o'-war, that are also genuine colonies in the evolutionary sense that they are composed of zooids that at an earlier period had disconnected existences, but became so closely physiologically integrated and so specialised that they are now entirely dependent upon each other. One of the most beautiful and most remarkable classes of the whole animal kingdom, nay, perhaps the most splendid of all, is formed by the little-known compound jellyfish, the Siphonophorae. These are swimming colonies of hydra medusae, whose delicate beauty and graceful movements are no less attractive than their exceedingly remarkable organisation. They are best compared to swimming stalks of flowers, with pretty leaves and flowers, the fruit of which seem made of coloured glass. Haeckel thought these creatures so astonishingly beautiful, he named two of the species that he found after his first wife, Anna Sethe, Mitrachoma annae and Desmonemi anasethe. The first of these, Mitrachoma, he encountered in a tidal pool as he walked, grief-stricken, along the bay of Villafranca near Nice just weeks after Anna had died from pleurisy. Her death had fallen on his 30th birthday, and that same day, the 16th of February 1864, he had received word that he'd been awarded the Cathenius Medal of the Leopold Caroline Academy of German Natural Scientists for his work in marine biology. The award now meant nothing to him, for as he wrote in days before his discovery, "I am dead on the inside already, and dead for everything. Life, nature, and science have no appeal to me. How slowly the hours pass." Many years later, when the trauma of that loss had subsided, he remembered this encounter, explaining how something about the movement of Mitrachoma, this princess of the Euclipidian, as he termed it, had offered a magical view, and I enjoyed several happy hours watching the play of her tentacles, which hang like blonde hair ornaments from the rim of a delicate umbrella cap, and which the softest movement would roll up into short, thick spirals. The tentacles, it seems, were reimagined as a life-affirming bob of oceanic ringlets. The death of Anna and the appearance of Mitrachoma were somehow strangely connected and thereafter became tangled, knotted together in all manners of ways. As his biographer Robert Richards writes, "For Haeckel, love fled and hid her face amongst the sea creatures." Anna was lost, but Haeckel came to think still vicariously present within a larger unfolding and interconnected world of biological diversity and beauty, a vision of nature as a creative and yet sensible whole that offered a non-dualistic, in his terms a monistic, and also a worldly sense of eternally evolving life. This vision, neither reductively materialist nor airily spiritual, assuaged, even if it never eradicated, the sense of Anna's loss, a loss which drove him, as he admitted in a letter to Darwin, to plan a work that would encapsulate his new nature philosophy. This exposition of metaphysical monism and Darwinian evolution was published 2 years later as the General Morphology of Organisms. Amongst many other startling innovations in this text, a new term appeared for the first time: ecology. Haeckel explains in a footnote in the General Morphology that this term ecology is derived from the Greek oikos, which he glosses as household or housekeeping, living relations. Ecology imagined as a household, as housekeeping, and as living relations. Yet if we stop to think for a moment, there are tensions within this definition and this imagery that usually go entirely unrecognised. Tensions, for example, between dwelling together, managing, and living together with. We can readily trace a detailed history of how one of these meanings, that of housekeeping, itself taken in a narrowly economistic sense as a form of managerial accountancy rather than its many possible broader senses, for example, of sustaining or keeping a dwelling place safe against exigencies, has come to dominate the ways we now imagine ecology to be lacking any ethical political sense of community with us. That's to say, since Haeckel, ecology has often become past, as the title of Donald Worcester's History of Ecological Ideas exemplifies, as nature's economy. For as we are ceaselessly reminded, economy and ecology share the same etymological root in ancient Greek. The danger, of course, is that given the overarching dominance of neoliberal understandings of economics, we come to imagine nature in these same terms, as selfishly individualistic, competitive, market-driven, instrumental and objectifying. And then we begin to think that nature is not just like economics, it can actually be evaluated by and made subservient to the same extraordinarily narrow understanding of economics that currently holds sway. But contemporary capitalism's most fundamental mistake, a mistake which many species quite literally end paying for, that is, they are driven to extinction, is to think that nature can be reduced to, contained by, or made subservient to the far from real world of market forces. That nature is considered only as a natural resource, providing the market with raw materials, or in its latest iteration, ecological services, is not only crass, it is the single most dangerous idea of our time. It also marks a complete lack of imagination, for it simply accepts and elaborates upon the narrow economism of a worldview that has increasingly set itself over and against any and every idea of community. And if everything is dominated by individualistic or corporate competition, itself a very unrealistic ideal, and if, to recall Mrs. Thatcher's infamous remarks, there's no such thing as society, then perhaps ecological community itself is a fiction, the last vestige and hiding place of those crypto-communist scoundrels, that enemy within, environmentalists. It is, though, worth recalling that Mrs. Thatcher's remark made by her in an interview in 1987 became such a focus of contention that even a year later, Downing Street still found itself having to clarify it in a philosophically self-contradictory missive to the Sunday Times. Mrs. Thatcher, they said, meant society as such does not exist except as a concept. Society is made up of people. If society is just a concept, then it is one that Thatcher too, despite her ideology, seemed to find indispensable, since in the same original interview she remarks, in any structure, in any society. I'm not going to try and impersonate Margaret Thatcher. But more importantly, what many people found so shocking about her statement back when such extreme neoliberalism still seemed shiny and new, rather than a tawdry excuse for stock market profiteering, was precisely that it denied the reality and importance of the living relations between people. It denied that people could create anything between them that could matter more than a narrow economistic housekeeping that ripped apart so many actual lives, homes, families and communities in the name of an ideology under which all life and death should be subsumed. And if this kind of housekeeping applies to human societies, its effects on any sense of community with other species are even more profound. From a neoliberal perspective, endangered species are, with rare exceptions, usually just impediments to economic growth. And here we can witness recent attacks on the Endangered Species Act in the United States and similar moves in Canada too. So let's not be suckered by etymology. Ecology is not, nor has it ever been, economy, even in ancient Greece. For Aristotle, as is well known, begins his politics with a discussion of the relations between the household, oikia, and the city-state, the polis. And for Aristotle, the household is a place of particular living relations, albeit ones that are very circumscribed, hierarchic, and patriarchal. And the acquisition of money through retail trade is explicitly excluded from this household management. This doesn't mean Aristotle ignores the acquisition of wealth. In addition to his very far from ideal social relations, he recognises that there is another element of household, the so-called art of getting wealth, which according to some, he says, is identical with household management, and according to others is a principal part of it. And the nature of this art will also have to be considered. But in the course of this consideration, he makes a crucial distinction between two kinds of wealth getting. One is, he terms necessary and natural, a form of accumulating food and other necessities from nature, where the housekeeper has to order the things which nature supplies. This Aristotle compares to weaving, only using, he says, the earth or the sea or the like as a source of food. The housekeeper weaves the natural world into the household community. The acquisition of these natural riches, of course, he says, has a limit. The other form of wealth giving, which Aristotle terms chrematistics, is concerned with coin, for coin is the unit of exchange and the limit of it. It's the confusion of these two forms and the dominance of the former by the exchange relations that characterize the latter that Aristotle regards as problematic, and precisely because chrematistics allows, quote, getters of wealth to increase their hoard of coin without limit. But how, Aristotle asks, can that be wealth of which a man, like King Midas, may have a great abundance and yet perish with hunger? Only, he says, because these are riches of a spurious kind. To be absolutely clear, then, there are, says Aristotle, two sorts of wealth getting. One is a part of household management, the other is retail trade. The former is necessary and honourable, while that which consists in exchange is justly censured, for it's unnatural and a mode by which men gain from one another. The most hated sort, and with the greatest reason, is usury, which makes a gain out of money itself and not from the natural object of it. How tactless. And of course, few would want to return to Aristotle's actual social and political ideals, while his understanding of what is natural is itself patently ideological. Nonetheless, it's worth bearing in mind just how far his notion of this one aspect of oikoia, of housekeeping, differs from the understanding of economics that now prevails in every corporation, School of Business Studies and government office. Of course, it's not just etymology that suggests links between economy and ecology can be drawn so closely. Although Haeckel himself produced several definitions of ecology, none of which were cut and dried, as Stauffer says, the most quotable and by far the most cited is taken from what Stauffer calls a free rather than a literal translation by Ali et al. In 1949 of his inaugural lecture to the University of Jena in 1869. By ecology, we mean the body of knowledge concerning the economy of nature, the investigation of the total relations of the animal both to its inorganic and to its organic environment, including, above all, its friendly and inimical relations with those animals and plants with which it comes directly or indirectly into contact. In a word, ecology is the study of all those complex interrelations referred to by Darwin as the conditions of the struggle for existence. Ecology, the economy of nature, and the struggle for existence thus seem to be irretrievably linked, perhaps even made formally equivalent to each other. What is more, the idea of the struggle of existence seems to have obvious links to those notions of economic competition between self-interested individuals, which both Darwin and Haeckel's capitalist contemporaries argue exemplified the natural way of the world. We should note, though, that Darwin actually used the terms economy of nature and polity of nature interchangeably, and that both were translated in H.G. Bronn's German edition, the one which Haeckel read by the term Naturhaushalt. Here too we can trace a history of the elision of understandings of ecology as nature's household and as the polity of nature to a naturalized version of a purportedly politics-free economics. Yet it was certainly the case that when Darwin and Haeckel used the term economy of nature, they had in mind a metaphorical connection to a much broader notion which was at that time termed political economy. This emphasis should be borne in mind even when we think of obvious connections between capitalism and evolutionary understandings of nature's economy. For example, the explicitly recognised by Darwin himself, influence of the Reverend Thomas Malthus's work on Darwin's theories. After all, Malthus was no village vicar serving tea and cucumber sandwiches to his parishioners, but the professor of history and political economy at the East India Company College in Hertfordshire. That is to say, he was an employee of a private university funded by and for one of the world's first and largest global corporations. Of course, there's no doubt that Darwin did assume that natural selection would operate primarily at the level of the individual, and they often emphasised direct competition for resources as the key reason for differential production of surviving progeny in subsequent generations, and for extinctions. Such views even led Marx, that other famous analyst of political economy, to declaim, "It's remarkable how Darwin recognises amongst beasts and plants of his English society, with its division of labour, its competition, its opening up of new markets, invention, and the Malthusian struggle for existence. It is," says Marx, "Hobbes bellum omnium contra omnes." But this is wrong. Despite the centrality of Fraser's economy of nature and struggle for existence in their writings, neither Darwin nor Haeckel envisaged evolution or the nascent ecology as just a naturalised version of laissez-faire economics, nor cutthroat competition, and nor should we. As Darwin remarked, "I should premise that I use the term struggle for existence in a large and metaphorical sense, including dependence of one being on another, and including, which is more important, not only the life of the individual, but success in leaving progeny. Two canine animals in a time of dearth may be truly said to struggle with each other as to which shall get food and live. But a plant on the edge of the desert is said to struggle for life against the drought, although more properly it should be said to be dependent upon the moisture. The mistletoe is dependent on the apple and a few other trees, but only in a far-fetched sense can it be said to struggle with those trees. For if too many of these parasites grow on the same tree, it will languish and die. As the mistletoe is disseminated by birds, its existence depends on birds, and it may be metaphorically said to struggle with other fruit-bearing plants in order to get birds to disseminate its seeds rather than those of other plants. In these several senses, which pass into each other, I, for convenience sake, use the term struggle for existence. The struggle for existence, if such it is explicitly not just the narrow, unremitting dog-eat-dog competition that's often permeated under various versions of neoliberal theory. Rather, this phrase is an unfortunate, albeit on certain specific occasions more or less accurate shorthand for the complex relations between living beings, their milieu, and the combined and key selective pressures operating within and, more importantly, across generations, the same pressures that lead in some circumstances to extinction. Actually, the most important thing Darwin took from Malthus was not, as Marx thought, a Hobbesian struggle of each against all. For the passage from the Origin quoted makes it quite plain that Darwin considers universalising such struggle far-fetched. He could in any case have taken this directly from Hobbes if he'd been so inclined. What Darwin actually, and somewhat ironically, took from Malthus's economic liberalism was a notion of limits to infinite growth, and of the roles of these natural limits in life and death, survival or extinction. So when Darwin cautions against taking the phrase struggle for existence too literally, we should take him at his word, even if he sometimes loses sight of this proviso himself. Despite how Darwin is usually interpreted, we are not then speaking of a struggle for existence in some overarching way, as a unitary and fundamental principle that rules all interactions between living beings. Natural selection is precisely not a war of all against all. It's a matrix of relations between individuals and more than just of individuals, where some die, some live, where some leave progeny, others don't, but where all are absolutely dependent on the existence of others in innumerable, incredibly varied and complicated ways. And that too, I think, was Haeckel's understanding, as exemplified by the definition originally aired in his Darwin book, The General Morphology. By ecology, we mean the whole science of the relations of the organism to the environment, including in the broad sense all the conditions of existence. These are partly organic, partly inorganic in nature, As organic conditions of existence, we consider the entire relations of the organism to all the other organisms with which it comes into contact, and of which most contribute either to its advantage or its harm. Each organism has amongst the other organisms its friends and its enemies, those which favour its existence and those which harm it. Ecology on this reading is something far richer and far stranger than any economic or even any political analogy can portray, something constituted by all the conditions of existence, organic and inorganic, whether friendly or inimical, together touching upon one another in all manner of ways. Ecology is a matter of myriad existence relationships across and between astoundingly different beings and species in incredibly varied environments. Indeed, ecology, according to Haeckel, concerns the entire relations of the organism to all other organisms with which it comes into contact. And if we resist the constant temptation to think this definition reductively and abstractly as something that just applies to economic relations between other non-human beings and species, if we use our imaginations, then its philosophical implications are truly astonishing. Richard's own translation of Haeckel's definition of ecology as the entire science of the relationships of the organism to its surrounding external world, wherein we understand all existence relationships in the wider sense, also, I think, helps conserve something of this fundamental philosophical richness and strangeness. Ecology is not just about the struggle for existence, about survival. It's all about existence relationships in this much wider sense, that is, in terms of the ways in which living beings, organisms, together co-constitute ecological communities through their being with all others that touch them in many different ways. Ecology is, we might more properly say, a matter of our existential interdependencies, and as such cannot be separated from questions concerning our worldly being and becoming and passing. It is, to adapt Narcis's idiom, the mutual but far from equivalent exposure of each being to every other being it touches upon. This coming into contact, this being touched by, this being exposed to, is after all the very ontological condition of existence. No living being in the world, says Derrida, commenting on Nancy's work, can survive for an instant without touching, which is to say, without being touched. We cannot survive one instant without being with contact and in contact. And he had, Aristotle said this very well. Being in the world is being touched, not by everything all of the time, not in the sense of some holistic totality, but sometimes and in some places and in some ways by some beings, by those beings who, existing together, constantly reconstitute a community with nothing in common, again, marked to Alfonso Lingus' work, with no single thread that runs through it all, nothing but a knotting of contiguities, in Nancy's terms, the interlacing of strands whose extremities remain separate even at the very centre of the knot. A community not in the sense of some totalising integration and a subsumption of everything under a unitary process or a principle, but only in their being with, the sharing out of their worldly exposure, one to each other. Sharing in a world not in the sense of dividing it up and partitioning it, not even in the sense of sharing it out more or less equally, but sharing in the creation of the sense of the world, a world which is not just a concept and not one just made up of people, but a world of incomparable differing, deferring, signifyingness, a fundamental and inescapable being in touch one with another, without either side being able to appropriate for itself what happens there as its own. Reimagining Haeckel's ecology in such a way opens the possibilities of a science, a form of knowledge and wisdom that recognises the many varied and incommensurable and irreducible senses in which this contact occurs, not least in the different sensory registers that these diverse yet evolutionarily attuned beings experience the event of touch, senses that far exceed human comprehension. Ecology, we might say, concerns itself with a sense of what comes into contact with living beings. What comes into contact is what touches, what makes, creates sense, what presents itself, what makes its presence felt to others, whether in a friendly or an inimical way. The siphonophores bobbing ringlets that so touched Haeckel's heart are also, as he certainly knew better than anyone, tentacles that sting. The ideology of neoliberalism flatly denies that there can be any such thing as a community. But community is not a thing. It's not a thing at all, not one object amongst others. It is a fundamental ontology of sense, the sense of our symbiotic existence, our existential relations, our being placed in contact with others, our shared exposure, and our being in the world together. And there is no being without being with. Not symbiosis in a sense which emphasises only mutualistic relations, although these have certainly been ignored and marginalised in most descriptions of nature's economy, but symbiosis in its broader and actually its original biological sense, which would include mutualistic as well as competitive and even parasitic relations. To put it in other words, there's no escaping ecology, even for those who refuse to recognise any community with the more than just human world, and in doing so condemn so many species of beings to extinction. Today, says Jeremy Jackson, synergetic effects of habitat destruction, overfishing, introduced species, warming, acidification, toxins, and the massive runoff of nutrients are transforming what's complex ecosystems like coral reefs and kelp forests into monotonous level bottoms, transforming clear and productive coastal seas into anoxic dead zones, and transforming complex food webs topped with big animals into simplified, microbially dominated ecosystems with boom and bust cycles of toxic dinoflagellate, blooms, jellyfish, and disease. Jellyfish and their ilk, it seems, may be amongst the few species to bloom in these depleted oceans. But attention on these blooms has largely focused on their economic impacts on tourism, as for example in 2009 when unprecedented numbers of Portuguese man-o-war were washed up on British coasts. Or, for example, another one here I've pulled from the literature, the commercial extinction of the beluga caviar industry, and so on. In August 2002, nearly 1 million salmon were killed at 2 Scottish fish farms by Solmaris, a tiny hydra medusa. Nanomia in the Gulf of Maine and the much larger and stingier Apolemia in Norway have all called what Gershwin terms stinging plagues. Nanomia has been found in densities of up to 100 a cubic metre. But the irony is that this rise is itself incumbent on the collapse of what Gershwin also calls the ground fish community in the northern Atlantic, including cod, due to commercial trawling and overfishing. Nanomia, like juvenile cod, also preys on copepods. The very fish farms, too, that attempt to profitably excise salmon from contact with their wider ecological community are themselves part of the reason for the changing marine conditions in certain localities that allow certain jellyfish or siphonophores to stage their Malthusian increases. Even when these ecological contiguities, these chain reactions are recognised, their consequences are pressed into the same ubiquitous economistic frame. Remarking on the salmon deaths, Gershwin continues, another company lost 400 tonnes of salmon that were fully grown and ready for market, almost as if it's this financial loss, touching only on corporate bank balances, that's the real tragedy here, the only thing that will count. This globalised economic system and ideology forces life to become imagined as nothing more than a struggle for survival. There's another quote I found. As the world fisheries begin to experience serious declines, it's relevant to recognise that the carnivorous jellyfishes are ubiquitous and are thus opportunistically positioned to utilise secondary production that's ordinarily consumed by fish. On one level, that is a perfectly normal biological explanation. On another, the language it uses obviously buys into a certain kind of worldview. How ironic, says Jackson, that the same activities, though, that are driving rapid industrialization and technological achievements are threatening to push marine ecosystems way back to the future. That is, to flagellate and jellyfish-dominated systems reminiscent of the Paleozoic. This is, it seems, economic progress, but it's ecological carnage. A world, says Nancy, is precisely that in which there's room for everyone, but a genuine place, one in which things can genuinely take place in this world. Otherwise, this isn't a world, it's a globe, or a globe, a land of exile and a vale of tears. So we have contrasting imaginaries and realities of globalization, or, in the title of Nancy's book, The Creation of the World. And perhaps through Haeckel's Ecology, we can begin to imagine answers to Nancy's question. How do you engage the world? How do you involve yourself with the enjoyment of the world as such, and not with the appropriation of quantity of equivalence? How do you give form to a difference of values that would not be a difference of wealth in terms of a general equivalence, but rather a difference of singularities in which alone the passage of meaning in general and the putting into play of what we call a world can take place? In other words, how do we concern ourselves in imagining a world that is not reducible to the formal equivalence of chromatistics, but recognises the diverse forms in which earth and sea and the like are woven together in our dwelling here in this world, a world with inordinate riches and an uncommon wealth of interdependencies that are always irreducible to coin. We make sense not by setting a price or a value, says Nancy, but by exposing the absolute value that is the world by itself, as the being with of all that is. This recognition and this imagination, this sense of ecological community, suggests why the appearance of Mitrachoma could begin to assuage Haeckel's despair at Anna's extinction. She touched him.
Thank you very much, Mick. Time for questions. Yeah, Josh.
So I have a question about some of the broad terms they're using. Ecology, extinction wasn't a term that you really brought up. So, and the reason I ask is because in ecology you have it's both a normative term and an ontological term, and you really pushed it towards the ontology side. What do you think of extinction? It's both a normative, in the sense, not actually in sort of the language of values, but just a regular recurring process. So in that sense, it's also an ontological thing. And I'm just struck how, what I feel is when I read a lot of histories of ecology, how much it's about community togetherness, sort of co-implication. But extinction is not, it cannot be thought in that term, in those terms. It is sort of a loss of community or a break or a missing, you know. And just the last sort of thing that kind of fits in this debate is that the language of wealth and value often sort of somehow bridges the gap between the two. You know, we're saying extinction is a loss of richness, it's a depletion of wealth, it's a kind of wastage. So money language sort of kind of bridges these ecology and extinction lines. So what do you think of those?
Yeah, well, I was trying explicitly at the end to use the term richness in a different, broader sense, right? In terms of the meaning of, in terms of, you might talk about the richness of life, those kind of things. So I think there are normative and ontological questions here. But one of the interesting things is if we don't recognise any community to start with, then there is no space for those kind of normative questions to come into play, I don't think. If we see this, if we as people don't feel any community, if we think that somehow we're outside of that, or that community is only something that can apply to other species other than us, then that's a huge gulf, right? That's a gulf almost as big as the Cartesian gap, right, between the mind and the body. And I think what any way of trying to think about ecological community. And this is like a crazy idea to try and do this, right? Because it's trying to bridge different discourses in very different disciplines. Right? But the history, the actual history of terms like ecological community shows that there have always been those kind of normative, as you suggest, like, there have always been those normative aspects there. If you unpack the notion of symbiosis, for example, and where that goes back to Frank's definition of that, which a mycologist who was at the time trying to find a way out of debates about mutualism in terms of algae and fungi in lichens, right? So the debate has been whether or not the algae were actually enslaved, and these are the kinds of terms that were used by the fungi in that kind of relationship, and whether it made any sense to talk about this in terms of a kind of evolutionary mutualism, or whether or not we could do that. But what Frank was trying to do when he actually introduced the term symbiosis is to say, well, we can actually, here's a way of trying to stand back from that a little bit. Right? But I don't think we can stand back from that. And I think if we take that term symbiosis and try and think about it philosophically, that opens a whole new host of possibilities for starting to bridge some of those gaps. Right? So it doesn't, this kind of model, Nancy's model is not going to come out with a view that says, you have to go out and save species X, right? It can't work its way through in that way, I don't think. It's not going to come out with that kind of normative program. Well, what it does is by starting with the ontology of things, it actually says there's something wrong with thinking about the world in this way. Here's another way of thinking about it. And actually, when we start to look through these things, this way is not so different from the way in which people start to use terms like ecology, often in a broad and loose sense too, but often try and think in terms that come closer to that, if that makes any sense. I don't know.
Right. Personally?
Yeah, thank you for a very complex talk. I love the word community, but I'm also deeply, deeply suspicious of it, although in the North American context it seems sort of inevitable. And I wanted to ask a couple of questions about it. One is, that, a world, a community in which there's room for everyone. Patently we know that that's not true. Nobody mourns the extinction of the smallpox virus. I was going to ask a question about the viruses that Debbie mentioned too, right? We're worried about those flying foxes, but we're now worried about viruses. And in fact, we're happy to see them go, which goes to the whole question of predation and the inherent violence of community relations, such as you described in ecology. Now, it's interesting that Haeckel, to my knowledge, actually does not use the term Gemeinschaft. He uses Lebensbeziehung, which is life relationship, which could be murderous. So community. I think the reason I'm suspicious about it is that it tends to emphasize mutualism and the sort of supportive relationship and leaves out the way in which your survival is predicated on somebody else's death. So that would be, I'm just kind of wondering, and following from that, I'm also a little.
Okay, I need a pen if it's another
question. Neoliberalism actually, is as opposed to community, where there creates simply different kinds of community. It don't fit into the older sort of village-based mutualism.
Okay, I'll try and remember different aspects. So no, and I wouldn't want to go the Gemeinschaft way of talking about things either, because for some of the possible political implications of that too. And I think the living relations thing is purposely a looser way of talking about those kinds of things. But of course, actually, most ecologists are quite happy talking about ecological community too. Right? And I was trained as an ecologist originally, so as a scientific ecologist. And when I did that, we had courses in community structure, for example, right? And it was very interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, if we use an alternative term, so if we use another term, let's say if we replace ecological community with ecosystem, then we introduce a whole new way of thinking about a whole new series of connotations too that are not apolitical. Right? The term system also has certain political connotations. It has a history. It comes from notions of cybernetics. It fits with the techniques that we have here and now in the world at the moment. It's not a neutral term. And so it's interesting, so you might choose one but from the other. It would be very difficult to make this bridge, I think, with a notion of ecosystems. Some people try to do that, but largely what we do is end up with natural systems, social systems, and then we try somehow to say somehow they fit together. They kind of push together like this, right? And still we have sociologists and philosophers and so on talking past ecologists and talking past natural scientists. In the environmental studies department, is one of the things that we try and do is get people to get past that. It's so difficult. So now I've lost track of where I was with answering the other.
I was just wondering, but if you shift it then to systems or to relationships, then arguably the extinction of one particular species or another doesn't matter, so long as there's another one that can take up the slack and reconstitute that relationship.
Yeah, that's why I never use the term ecosystem in my work at all, ever. I've never used it.
Other questions?
Try it again. You paint a pretty bleak picture at the outset of your talk, the neoliberal economic globalization and so forth, industries and environmental groups and so forth that are collaborating because of signals from market forces that make players, particularly in industry, but in fact, quite realize people would be quite happy to say, yeah, I remember that. I mean, that's where they come from. You're right, they're not ashamed of it. But nevertheless, they respond to market signals that encourage conservation. But this is at a more local scale, right? Is it a scale independency of these two phenomena that we're talking about? Is it hopeless? Like at this higher echelon in the hierarchy, is that the big driver that's taking us to this implied future where, and despite all the local, good examples of local activity, they're not all successful, but what I would call good examples of local activity where market forces have nevertheless sort of stimulated, they've been a carrot for conservation efforts.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes when these kind of sometimes quite productive moves happen, then often the stimulus isn't just market forces, I think. Right? I think that actually you might have an industrialist who's actually quite emotionally and committed to their local environment in many ways. And so I think that's often the primary result here. The problem with just taking all of our cues from market forces is that market forces, blow backwards and forwards all over the place, right? In all kinds of ways. And if it's the market forces that really matter, then we're missing the signals from the kind of stuff that I think I'm trying to get at, right? Which is the sense of a broader community with the more than just human world. Yeah. Yeah. So, which I think is of ethical value. I mean, I have ethics and normative values myself, right? And I think that's of importance. So for me, that's what the point should be. If sometimes you can use these things pragmatically to that end, then maybe that's fine. But we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that because these things work pragmatically in some kind of senses, that is the end, actually. So I suppose that's how yeah. And I'm pretty depressed about the way things are going.
Sorry, did I understand you correctly in this exchange and at the end of your talk that you said you need to recognize a community in order to make statements about the value of species within them and therefore be worried about extinction? Because the way that you organized this definition of community, you said it's going to have to do with systems, it's going to have to do with replacement. But should I be taking away from this talk that this structure of community allows me to place value on individual species or not?
It allows you to. Yes, it would allow you.
It offers another way to.
It would allow you to, but it wouldn't predetermine what those values might be. Yeah.
But if I had another concept of community or no concept of community, how would that change my thinking?
Well, I tried to say, I think in the talk, what no concept of community leads to, right? Which is
in the context of extinction, what does it lead?
Well, it leads to seeing the whole of the world as a kind of struggle for survival, right? That's all it is. It's a struggle, an individualistic composition for survival. And sometimes expanded, right? That's expanded to species from individuals. because when I was doing ecology, and I'm pleased that it's changed somewhat now, the whole way in which communities were structured, we were told, was by interspecies competition, right? Which is a move away from individual competition, but now we're treating the species as an individual that somehow competes with other individuals. And it's been very interesting for me trying to get back into reading the scientific ecology for this book that I'm working on at the moment, that is no longer the case. And some of the people actually that I worked with, people like John Lawton and so on, at the time were already quite sceptical about that kind of attempt to provide one overarching notion, one way of understanding the way that communities hold together and operate.
Communities have scapegoats. Communities have hierarchies. There's a sense in which we only understand the hatred of the flying foxes by thinking about our relationship to them in a community fashion. But then that precisely raises the kinds of issues that Aristotle was getting at, because communities are not a model of harmony. Or we have some nostalgic romance for a community if we put that in. And so I wonder if you could talk about...
No, communities are, they're imagined communities too, right? So the imaginary, if you like, of a community that scapegoats the flying fox is one that has excluded the flying fox from that sense of community. You know? So that's the case with something, Anderson argues this with a nation state, right? A nation state has to be a kind of an imagined community too. It might have borders and all kinds of other things, but the way that people view themselves as Canadian or British or whatever it might be as part of a nation is also part of an imaginary kind of that's historically developed, that involves certain kinds of ideological understandings. And so, it's easy to see that, I think, that communities per se, as such, have often been built on precisely using models of what doesn't belong as a model to build community. I'm not trying to tout the notion of the word community as some kind of panacea for our ills, because of course the notions of community have been misused in all kind of manner of horrific political ways too. But what I think that Narcy is trying to get at is a different kind of model of ontology, a kind of recognition that we are all in contact, in touch with each other, that we are constituted ourselves through that. We are what he refers to as not so much singular beings, but what he refers to as being singular plural. In other words, that the way we actually come to understand ourselves too, and the kind of approaches we have, the kind of relations we have to those around us, are built on whether or not we recognize that plurality, the other aspect that actually feeds into who or what we are. And if we tend to cut ourselves off as a kind of an ideology that a kind of Hobbesian, ideology might do, for example, that sees everyone as self-interested individuals and little billiard ball kind of approach that bump into each other all over the place, then that kind of understanding doesn't have a ground to get any sense of a community off the ground, it seems to me. So these are big political questions too.
Yeah, I'm kind of struggling with how to put this, and I'm not sure if I will be neatly articulate, but listening to what you were saying about Hobbes and Darwin, I felt myself a little uneasy with the characterization of a community as a set of interdependencies. But these are interdependencies that are fundamentally physical interdependencies and not social interdependencies, right? And I don't really know how to put this, but it seems to me that that's not satisfactory either, right? That Darwinian conception of a community. How through a community, it's got to be something also social, and that's what emerges out of the Hobbesian sort of liberal conception of the sort of war of all against all, right? Out of this, this desire to remove ourselves from this fundamentally hostile environment.
Yeah, I think community is a much broader notion than that. Yeah, and I think that's why I would try right at the beginning to talk about the difference between that notion of a contractual notion of what community be, which might start with the isolated individuals in this, hostile environment, as you put it, right?
Yeah.
But the world is not always a hostile environment.
Oh, I agree.
We don't spend all our times competing with everything around us, and we are dependent on all kinds of aspects of the world in all manner of different ways. And so if we start with that kind of Hobbesian model, we're missing a lot out of the picture, right? And if we then say, well, that's a contract, well, this too, we could say that about the contract model, right? Because archetypally, that's a contract that animals and other species and other things can't sign, right? They're not part of the contract. So it seems to me that we have to start with a more fundamental ontological understanding of what a community might be to build from there. Otherwise, we're also going to be left with this other divide that you bring in, which is in some senses the same divide, the divide between society and nature, right? The social ideas of community, the natural ideas of community. And that's partly why this is such a crazy project, right? Because that's one of the key things that I want to aim at breaking down. I want a notion of community that doesn't keep falling back into that divide. Because animals are social too, right? All kinds of things are social in all kinds of ways, and in ways that we're only really just starting to understand, I think. I mean, this is a woodlander. My own work was on fungi when I was my graduate work, okay? And so I'm very interested in some of the interrelations that you find, the interconnections you find in woodland, and a lot of the debates about mutualism and symbiosis and so on started out around debates about fungi or lichens in terms of their fungal algal associations, but also in terms of rhizomes and so on, and root nodules and those kind of things they interest me, and they give a really much more complicated picture than just one tree competing against its neighbour for all of these resources, because it just seems actually that's not what's happening all the time. Of course, that's not to deny that competition happens, and I hope that was clear. That's there are dog-eat-dog circumstances, right? But that's not the be-all and end-all. That's not the universalizing principle which we could build a model of, or try to inhabit a world on.
I see questions still to come, but unfortunately we are out of time, so I'm going to have to put the rule of answer and keep us on schedule. So I want to be able to thank Mick for the